So thank you very much for having me this afternoon. I'd particularly also like to thank Interface for facilitating this kind of knowledge exchange between business and universities. It's very important, I like to think, for both of us, so thank you for having me. I should clarify that I'm talking about self-publishing as a business model in general, rather than business models in a detailed manner. The type of self-publishing I'm talking about is when you're really looking at selling content via an app. So the app itself could be your content, although some of this should also apply to other types of contents. I'm also from the Institutes for Arts, Media, and Computer Games, so I tend to have a games focus. Again, some of these can be generalized, particularly to book publishing and other types of publishing sectors. So we started off with a dream. And the dream was that the internet was going to make everything free and wonderful, and we would be engaged directly with our customers, and self-publishing meant we could avoid gatekeepers and we could get directly involved with customers, none of this intermediaries and dealing with the middleman. But I'm not so sure that that's true, and I'm not so sure that self-publishing is quite the dream that we expected it to be. So what is the dream and what was the reality? And that's what I'm going to talk about, is what we hoped might happen and what it kind of looks like, and whether or not self-publishing may or may not be the right model for you. So this is what the model used to look like, or at least this is one of the models in games publishing. And in this case, you have the commissioner. So like in television, you would have a commissioning body. Then you have the developer, and the developer actually would make the game, who would then sell it to a publisher, and sometimes the commissioner and the publisher were the same person. And then it would go to a distributor, and then the distributor in box product particularly, so games used to be very much sold on the high street in boxes, was then sold to the retailer, and then finally it got to the customer. So if you want to identify where you might fit into this value chain, you would be the developer. So that's what we use in games as a term for the people who actually create the content. Throughout this chain, you can see that everyone's getting a slice of both the money and the intellectual property and any underlying assets there. So by the time you get from commissioner to customer, maybe only one little segment along those lines, particularly if you're the developer. So the idea is that self-publishing takes all of that away. You remove all these intermediaries, so the idea was disintermediation, the removal of intermediaries, and instead the developer is in direct contact with customers. So you sell your things directly to the customer. None of this intermediaries, straightforward, don't have to go through gatekeepers, don't have to worry about the rest of it. But is this actually the case? And I would argue that probably no, it is not the case anymore. There was a short time of a bit of gold rush, which I believe other speakers have referred to, where the apps market was less crowded, and yes, it was fairly straightforward for developers to get more in contact with their customers. But as the app market gets more crowded, it's a little bit more difficult to do so. And I think Richard Wilson, who is the TIGA, and TIGA is one of the national games associations in the UK, put it best. It's no wonder some developers see self-publishing as the siren's call. It's quite a seductive model. You remove all these intermediaries. You're not worrying about servicing your publisher, your commissioner, etc. You are much more in contact with your customers. However, as he's quite rightly put, as Richard Wilson mentions, it is a little bit of a siren's call. The reality is that if you do it without thinking strategically, as our previous speaker mentioned, that you really could end up in a poor business situation and wasting money. So this is what it probably looks like. Self-publishing is actually more you, the developer, so a games developer, working with a platform, and alongside that platform we have a whole series of other services and goods and other types of important things to engage with. So blogs are very important for getting your apps noticed, reviews, rankings, shopping carts for actually the ability to pay for things, servers, cloud service is the new wave of the future, storefronts, getting through the approval process, legal issues, all of that is associated with the platform that you're talking about. And when I say platform, I mean the Android store, the Apple store, or other things like Nook, Amazon, Facebook, so the other types of platforms for self-publishing. And those still sit between you and the customer, and they serve a very important purpose. So pros of self-publishing. It still has quite a lot going for it. And the first thing is creative control. And this is very important if your app is about selling content, because having creative control can be very important to your own motivations and interests in having apps. So having creative control is important. The other is that you retain a larger percentage of revenue. So if you saw the previous model, it got sliced and sliced and sliced. With less intermediaries, you potentially have more of the actual percentage of revenue. Now, the question is, how much revenue is that? I mean, has the pie shrunk or grown? The other is you retain more intellectual property. So in the previous model where we had commissioners, publishers, etc., everyone was either leasing or licensing types of intellectual property, but oftentimes the developer didn't actually have any control over it long run, which means that if they had a hit on their hands, they didn't necessarily have the ability to do sequels and generate more income later on. So it means that some of these projects were very short term. So potentially self-publishing means you've got more of your own intellectual property. The other is the avoidance of gatekeepers. You no longer have to go through the publishing, commissioning, etc. Model in order to get approved and actually to customers, which has advantages. However, cons of self-publishing. This is not an exhaustive list. You are now responsible, if you are publishing your own content, so if you are putting it out on a platform yourself and not engaging with these other types of intermediaries, you are now responsible for financing. So in the previous model, you often got paid up front or paid for development costs, whereas now it's your own self-funded. Marketing and promotion should not be underestimated. One of the great abilities of publishers is the fact that they have the marketing budgets and know-how to get your content out there. Curation. The App Store itself and Android also, for example, are really overwhelming sometimes for customers, and I think we just talked about how it's difficult to find the good app that you're really looking for. If the things aren't curated, it's difficult to find for people to find good content, and it's confusing for the customer. So you need to actually make sure within your own platform or your own content that you're creating correctly. Branding, if you're a small company, working with a publisher is actually a good advantage because they may have a very strong brand. Editing, that's a big one from book publishing, for example, is the editing process actually ensures that there's a quality control. And if you're doing that yourself, while I'm sure your content is great, having external feedback on it is quite a useful service. Customer service, anything goes wrong, it's now your problem. Troubleshooting, same thing. And managing payments. So all of these things are now your responsibility, whereas before they might have been the responsibility of somebody else. I should also add legal services and dealing with intellectual property are also now your responsibility. The other part, it is a crowded marketplace. I think that's probably been covered sufficiently. And you are a small fish, potentially, in a big pond, whereas publishers are often bigger fish in these big ponds. So that means that your bargaining power is rather little. So you don't have much leeway when you're engaging with these platforms. So if you're looking at Amazon, Android, iTunes, or Facebook, you're really not in a position to bargain with them. It's kind of a take it or leave it deal. So if they say no, you're unlikely to be able to come back and say, well, let's work it out. It depends, of course. The other is the standard 30-70 split. So all of these platforms that I've listed, Amazon, Android, iTunes, and Facebook, and I believe the other ones like Nook, are all having a 30-70 standard split. So that means the platform keeps 30% and you get 70% of all revenues. That includes payments within the app and actually buying the app itself. Good news is that's significantly better than what it used to be in games. So if you look at mobile games about 10, 15 years ago, it was, if you were lucky, the opposite. So if you were lucky, you got 30% of the revenue. So that's good. The bad news is you're still having to get, out of that 70%, you're having to pay anyone else that you're having to license in content or other services from. So it's a static split. You're not going to be able to change that. And the other is that there's new gatekeepers. So these new platforms are now the gatekeepers of all of this content. So to make that a little bit more clear, I thought I'd take a look at Dynamo Games. I don't know if anyone's familiar with them. They're based in Dundee. They're a games company. And they started about a decade ago. And they started off with developing mobile games for publishers. So you can see at the bottom, they've got Championship Manager. So they worked with the owners of the Championship Manager intellectual property as the brand and created mobile applications for games. And they still do that. And that's been great for them because it's allowed them to build up their company and learn about the process. And it's really been a very important tool for the establishment and growth of Dynamo Games. Since then, however, they're moving more into self-publishing. And there are some, it's not a straightforward path, but one of the things they've been doing is self-publishing mobile games. You can see they've got a picture of Crystal Maze. Anyone know the game? It was a game show. So they, quite cleverly, licensed an existing popular brand and made an app out of it. And that's really one good way, if you're talking about selling content, is licensing in a well-established, renowned brand. The other thing they're doing is self-publishing online Facebook games. So we have Beauty Town, which was also in conjunction with Channel 4. So in both cases, they're using their core games knowledge and engaging with other established brands in order to self-publish. So it's kind of a hybrid self-publishing model, but it means that they have a lot more creative control, and they own the IP, and they have more intellectual property, a higher share of the revenue at the end of the day. So that's where things are going in games. So when self-publishing can work, it can work if you have a clear and targeted audience. So if your audience is a niche market, then actually self-publishing might be the way forward. The other is that if you're targeted at existing customers. So I talked a lot about games today that are mostly content selling devices. So the app is actually what they're selling. If, for example, you're Lloyds Bank, your app is not actually to necessarily gain more customers or generate revenue through the app, but actually to service your existing customers. So in which case an app and self-publishing that app might be a way forward. If you have a strong brand. So if you've got a strong brand, self-publishing your own app may be a way forward. If you haven't got one, take a clue from Dynamo and consider licensing one. The other is content is so amazing. So we looked at some other examples. I think we talked about things like Rovio and things like that. If the content is so amazing, you may be okay without a publisher. Although Angry Birds does actually have a publisher. So yeah, if the content is so good, it's going to go viral and you'll be a success. And finally, luck. So potentially, self-publishing can work for you. And with that, I'd like to conclude with Minecraft, which is probably one of the greatest examples recently of a self-published app in games. They some kind of garage-type developers in Scandinavia, and I think they've got about 80 million in revenues in the last couple of years from their game. So it can work out. And thank you very much for having me.